Welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Today we're talking about mitering borders on a quilt. We're working with our double wedding ring quilt. We've got our borders put on. We've added a pink border and a purple border, and I am more pleased than I thought I would be with these borders. It really took it up a notch. It makes it look finished. It creates a frame around the design. Right on. So what we're going to do now, we've got these borders sewn on. We need to come up with that mitered corner. The first thing I checked was I used this ruler. And as you can see, this is a square, so we can make sure that our corner is square. But we can also see by the lines, the diagonal lines in this, and this actual center point, if our borders are set up properly to get that miter. So we're going to put that little hole in the center. I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's a hole right there. We're going to put that right where the purples match. They come together. And then we're going to line up on this one right here. It looks like the 5 mark. Perpendicular lines. We're going to line those up with the borders. And given that this is a handmade product, it looks good. It's lined up. And I can see that the pink on the very edge is pretty close to square. So what we have to do is figure out how to attach these two in this corner in a diagonal seam that comes out so that we've got nice sharp seam lines. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a marker. Excuse me. It's a little more stretch, and I didn't want to grab the permanent marker because that would be a disaster. So we've got this corner here. I'm just going to put a little dot right there. And then we have a corner that we can use here on that diagonal line. So we're going to put the edge now of the ruler from those 2 dots. And if we draw a line from those 2 dots on our top piece of fabric, and it is very light, I can see where I need to stitch to make that. Now, the only problem with that is I can't stitch the way it is because I've got one piece of fabric on top of the other. What I have to do is get right sides together. So I'm going to take this again and line it up, only taking into account that first piece of fabric. I'm going to pull my fabric over just so it's tight but not stretching it, and I'm going to lay my marker down so that it will mark right on the edge of that fabric. Whoops, a little bit off. Now remember, you're using a disappearing marker, not a permanent marker. You could use a pencil, but I'd be very careful with that. So now we have a faint little line on the back side of our fabric here. What we need to do at this point is get a line on the other fabric. So we're going to line that up where it was. We're going to slightly finger press it down. If you had a little roller, you could use that as well. And now we're going to make some marks on our underside on the right side of that bottom piece of fabric. So we folded up the top, the piece that's on top, we've folded it back. We've drawn a very light, it doesn't even have to be a solid line, but some little dots along the back side. So now you have a marking on this where the seam should be, and now you have some dots on this fabric where they should be. And the way we're going to transfer that is, you've seen me do this before, use the point of some very fine pins. I'm just going to stick them into the fabric where those dots are. And this is a guide. We've got our guide here where it needs to be. We'll put one there where the fabric joins up. Okay, so we've got those there. And then if we flip this over, where those pins are sticking out is now the guide for your line. And you can, it's going to be a little difficult because you're, whoops, it fell off the edge and it will pull on it, so we want to pull that back. You're trying to draw that line over your pins, so that makes it, the surface it's not flat, and your ruler's not going to lay down flat, so you want to just be mindful of that. You also, what just happened with me was the fabric fell off, and instead of a corner now it's kind of like this, so you need to readjust that. So here's where I'm going to start. I'm going to take this ruler. I'm on the back side of the quilt now. And I'm going to line up the diagonal line with the seam line. Nope, that doesn't work that way at all. Oh my. It's always fun. I'm going to line it. Okay, this is where I get confused. I'm going to line up this line with the edge of the pink fabric. And then I'm going to look at where those little pins are coming out. And I can see where I can go right from the pins. Through all these little things, all the way up to where the fabrics join. And I'm going to show you that. Can you see that? The pins have come out here, and I've taken my square and I've been able to draw a line connecting those places where the pins are coming out all the way here to the seam. So that gives us a great idea of where we need to stitch. Now, we've spent a lot of time putting these borders together. We've put the borders on the quilt, and now we're getting ready to sew these two borders together. So the one thing we don't want to happen is we don't want to mess it up, because if we have to take it out, these are bias seams that we're sewing, and they will tend to get stretched out of place. So my recommendation is when you go to stitch it, you're not going to have as much of a problem if you stitch it by hand, but if you're stitching it on the machine, make your stitch length a little bit longer. And I would recommend that you not put the back stitching on the edges, so that if you do have to take it out, it'll be easier to take it out. Now, that being said, once you get it the way you want to, I would put a little short line of stitches on the outside corner to hold them in place, and you may want to do a little hand stitch on the inside to hold that in place as well. Like I said before, we've still got to quilt this, so you're going to be handling it a lot, and there'll be always time to make a quick little stitch to put things back in place if you need to. So now we're going to fold these two pieces together. And because we stopped stitching at our joining point, we didn't overstitch, we should be able to pull these apart. The only thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to clip this corner of this white fabric almost to the seam. And that way that will allow us to fold this together like this. We're going to come together right at that point, and we want to make sure that basically it's laying out just like that. And we're going to sew from here, where there's a little blue dot on the other side, out to the edge, lining up those blue marks. And the way we're going to line those up, we're going back to the pins again. I'm going to start with this side because this has the darker spots. This is the one where we put the pins in and then we use the ruler to add the little dashes there. I'll put that in. Every place we've got a mark. There are other ways to do this, and I think it begins to be a matter of personal preference, what works best for you, because like a lot of things in life, there are a lot of ways to get to the same point. And a good example of this is you get in your car to go to a store, and there may be 3 different routes that you can take to it. And one may be shorter, one may be longer, one may have more scenery. But in that case, the goal is to get to your destination. So you take the one that works best for you. Same situation here. Miter corners are more complicated than just flat butted corners or overlapping corners, but you do have the advantage of having a little more decorative finish to your quilt. Okay, so we've lined this up, and now we're going to poke that pin in a little further, so where it came in on one side, it's going to be lining up with the seam line on the other side, if you can see that. Let me get the others and I'll show you. Just want to make sure that you're poking that pin in straight. It hasn't gotten a little wonky on you. And I noticed that this other side is just a little off. And when I say off, meaning that we probably had a little more grace in one side than the other. Remember we talked about grace? And so one is just a little bit longer. But we are getting there, and we are coming in for the finish. Okay, so there we are. You can see I've got my pins in. They start in the blue mark on one side, and they come to the blue mark on the other side. They're flat. They match up. I'm going to take one more look down this way. That one. We just want to make sure that linearly, in the line that they're matching up and they're going to be able to stitch through. Now I'm going to put a couple of pins within the seam allowance just so the fabric doesn't move. And we're going to go all the way back up here to this purple to pin it there as well. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn these other pins that we used as our marking pins so that the head of the pin is over in the seam allowance. Be out of the way. Whoops, and that one came out. Oh darn. Okay, now I'm going to sew a basting stitch on my machine, starting just not at the actual point where the fabrics meet in the inside, but just like one stitch away. I'd rather have a little tiny hole there where it's not stitched together than to try to deal with it if it's not matching up just a little bit. And we certainly can deal with that little tiny hole later, or it may not be visible at all. So give me just a second and I'll show you what happens after we put that line of stitching in. Okay, so we're back. I put a stitch in the corner here, joining the two borders together. And this line of stitching was a little bit longer than what I would normally sew with because here's what happened. The purple line here lined up just great, but here we missed the mark. And that's because I forgot to mark the edge of those purple strip when I was planning out how it needed to go. So I'm going to need to rip out probably all of this stitching from the middle of the purple strip out. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to pin it again. I may try to take out some of the stitching where that border is going together and see how much different it makes, whether I can join it back in. Maybe it just needs to be adjusted. It's not too far, so I think I can just adjust it a little bit and go from there. But like I said before, be careful because this is on a bias. You don't want to pull it too much, so you want to be careful when you stitch and you don't stretch it out of shape. So I'm going to get my nifty seam ripper and rip this out right there from the middle of the purple. And I'm going to start by doing it maybe an inch or inch and a half up the pink and see what we come up with. One good thing with these longer stitches, it is easier to get your seam ripper in there and take that line of stitching out. Okay, so we've taken that out now. And we're going to use the same technique. We're going to use a little pin and we're going to come in here on this diagonal line where that purple seam is, and we're going to try to match it with the other side where the purple seam should be. So I'm going to put a pin at each point. And you know, doing it that way, it really doesn't look like it's that far off, but putting it into practice, then that becomes a little different story. So we will need to adjust that, and I think one of them just needs to ease just a smidgen more. And it could be, what I'm doing now is I'm holding it up to the light so I can see where they're coming together. And then I put my pin in right on that seam where they should be coming. They're meeting together. I'll peek inside. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pin these two pieces to keep that purple seam lined up together so they don't get off kilter. And then we're just going to stitch that and see what we come up with. Hold on just a minute. I'll put that in the machine, and it shouldn't take but just a minute. Okay, I think we've got it now. I'm going to just take and take a little bit of this stitching out so it doesn't interfere with how it folds back, because we stitched right over that. Okay, so now I'm going to open that seam up in the back of that. Just a little finger press. And I'm going to take a pin and pin it so you can see on camera a little better, because sometimes when I'm holding it up it is a little hard to see. But now we have a mitered corner. It is a little finicky, I get that, but look at how that looks. Pretty impressive, and you can do it too. The first time I did a mitered corner, it was a bit challenging, but as you go on, you learn something new every time, and that's one of the things I love about quilting, is it might be something small, it could be something really big that you're learning, but you're learning something every time. And now, look at this. That's what we're looking for. I've got 3 more borders to do, 3 more corners to do, so I'm going to work on that. And then our next step is I want to actually put this quilt top on the bed and see how big it is. How does it fit? I can measure it and know that what the typical bed is, how big it is, and what the typical measurements are for a queen size quilt. And certainly, whether it's a little smaller or a little bigger, it'll work. You can put it on there, but I want to make sure that it's practical. As I discussed before, this will be one that will be used. And so I want to make sure that if someone is sleeping in this bed and they've got this quilt on, they're going to stay warm and comfortable. And in order to do that, it's going to need to be big enough. So our alternative, or our option, I should say, is to add a border of white if it needs to be bigger. And that would be the same fabric that's here. Or we can just go from here and move straight on to sandwiching the quilt and starting on the quilting process. So that's where we are. We'll be back at least one more time to talk about the size of the quilt and what the next steps are. And then we will move on from there and finish this project up. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad that you were here with us today. I hope you've learned something. If you like our videos and we've been useful to you, please like us and subscribe to our channel. This helps us with our viewers and it gets more videos out to you. We also have a Facebook page that you can visit us at the Shamrock Quilt Studio, where we share pictures and little short videos of things that are going on during the week between our regular videos, so you can find some encouragement and some ideas what to do next. Enjoy your quilting. We'll see you next time.